What would you do if the most powerful person in the room didn't look like it? And nobody figured that out until it was too late. I've been collecting stories like this for a while now. Stories where the world decides who you are before you even open your mouth. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world gets it spectacularly wrong. This is one of those stories. The morning Elise Fontaine walked into the lobby of Hartwell Capital, she was carrying a coffee that had gone cold somewhere on the 47 bus, wearing a jacket that had seen better days, and pulling a rolling suitcase with one broken wheel that dragged sideways on the marble floor with every step. Elise Fontaine, 34 years old, mixed race, Haitian-Canadian, with her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's quiet eyes. 5'4", slight build, hair pulled back in a bun that had started unraveling somewhere around Bloor Street. She looked, if you were being honest, like someone who had applied for the wrong job and knew it. The lobby of Hartwell Capital was the kind of space designed to make people feel small. 40-foot ceilings, glass everywhere. A reception desk made of something that might have been quarried from a mountain. The security guard at the front, a broad man named Glenn, with the posture of someone who had been told he was important, looked up when Elise walked in and immediately looked back down. She waited. He kept typing. She waited another 30 seconds, the broken wheel of her suitcase scraping faintly on the floor as she shifted her weight. Glenn looked up again. "Can I help you?" "I have a 9 o'clock," Elise said. "Elise Fontaine." Glenn typed something slowly, looked at his screen, typed something else. "What department?" "I'm here for the board review. Quantitative risk." Glenn stared at her the way people stare at a word they're sure is spelled wrong. He picked up the phone, murmured something into it, waited, murmured again. Then he put it down and handed her a visitor badge without making eye contact. 11th floor. "Someone will meet you." Nobody met her. She found the 11th floor herself, found the glass-walled boardroom herself, and walked in carrying her cold coffee and her broken suitcase to find 7 people already seated around a table long enough to land a small aircraft on. 7 people. All of them looking at her. None of them standing up. At the head of the table sat Russell Vane, 58 years old, silver-haired, square-jawed, the kind of man whose confidence was structural, built into him like load-bearing walls. He was the managing director of Hartwell Capital, 30 years in the industry, the sort of person whose handshake felt like a closing argument. He looked at Elise the way people look at weather they hadn't planned for. "Can I help you?" He said it with a smile. Same words as Glenn downstairs. Same energy. "I'm Elise Fontaine," she said, setting her coffee on the table. "The external auditor." Silence. Not a long silence, maybe 2 seconds. But in that boardroom, 2 seconds was a geological age. Russell Vane's smile didn't disappear exactly. It just reorganized itself into something more careful. To his left, a woman named Brenda Calloway, the head of compliance, 51, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like a crown, leaned over and whispered something to the man beside her. The man she whispered to was Thomas Grail, managing partner, 46. The kind of expensive that didn't announce itself but was impossible to miss. He was already looking at Elise the way he might look at a contractor who'd shown up without the right tools. "We were expecting someone from the Rousseau Group," Thomas Grail said. "You got someone from the Rousseau Group," Elise said. She pulled out the chair at the far end of the table, the one they'd clearly left empty as an afterthought, and sat down. "I've been with them 11 years. I'm the lead auditor on this file." Thomas Grail looked at Russell Vane. Russell Vane looked at Thomas Grail. Something passed between them that Elise had seen before, in other boardrooms, in other cities. It was the look that said, "Is she serious?" She was. Here's what nobody in that room knew about Elise Fontaine. She had grown up in Montréal-Nord. In a 2-bedroom apartment above a dépanneur her mother ran 7 days a week. Her father had left when she was 9. Her mother, Claudette, a Haitian immigrant with a grade 10 education and more practical intelligence than most people accumulate in a lifetime, had worked herself into arthritis by the time Elise was 15. Elise had learned math the way some kids learn to swim, because the alternative was drowning. She had tutored classmates for grocery money, won a scholarship to McGill that nobody in her neighborhood had heard of before, and graduated top of her program in mathematics and financial modeling. She had been recruited by 4 firms before she finished her master's degree. She had chosen the Rousseau Group because they were the only ones who hadn't assumed, during the interview, that she was there for an administrative role. In 11 years, she had audited 42 firms. She had flagged irregularities that had saved 3 pension funds from collapse. She had written a paper on cascading risk in over-leveraged portfolios that was now taught in 2 Canadian universities. Nobody in the boardroom knew any of this. They saw the jacket, the suitcase, the cold coffee, the unraveled bun. They had already made their decision about her. The review was supposed to take 3 days. By the end of day 1, the atmosphere in the Hartwell offices had taken on the quality of a house where someone has left a window open in winter. An uncomfortable draft that nobody could quite locate. Elise had asked, quietly and specifically, for access to 18 months of transaction records, the internal risk models, and the documentation on something called the Meridian Portfolio, a cluster of investments that had been restructured 4 times in 24 months without a clear paper trail. Thomas Grail had declined, politely. He'd cited protocol, data sensitivity, the complexity of the portfolio structure. Elise had nodded, written something in her notebook, and asked again. He declined again, less politely this time. Ms. Fontaine, he said, in the tone of a man explaining something to someone he's sure won't understand it, the Meridian portfolio involves instruments that are highly technical in nature. I'm not sure, He stopped himself. Elise looked at him. A generalist, he finished. She didn't react. She had a gift for stillness that unnerved people. She simply wrote something else in her notebook and said, I'd like to schedule a technical review session for tomorrow morning. If you can have your quantitative team ready at 8, that would be helpful. Thomas Grail smiled the way people smile when they're certain they've won. Of course. He thought it was a concession. He thought she was backing down. He was wrong about that. That evening, Elise sat in her hotel room, the same one she always booked, mid-range, close to transit, paid on the company card, and worked until past midnight. She had the data she'd been given access to. She also had 11 years of pattern recognition, a mind that processed financial anomalies the way a doctor spots infection, and a quiet, methodical fury that she never let anyone see. She'd found something, not in the documents they'd given her, in the gap between what they'd given her and what she'd asked for, in the way Thomas Grail had hesitated, one specific half-second pause when she'd asked about the Meridian restructuring timeline. In the footnotes of a quarterly report from 18 months ago, where a risk exposure figure had been listed 2 different ways in 2 different sections of the same document. It wasn't proof, not yet, but she knew the shape of it. She'd seen this shape before. The technical session the next morning was, she suspected, designed to humiliate her. Thomas Grail had brought 3 people. The first was Kevin Marsh, 38, Hartwell's head of quantitative analysis, who had the look of someone who had never once doubted himself and had statistics to back it up. The second was a junior analyst named Beth, who had been told, it seemed, to take notes and look unimpressed. The third was an older man, introduced only as our advisor, who sat in the corner with the deliberate stillness of someone brought in specifically to judge. Thomas Grail opened by asking Elise to explain her methodology. She explained it. Kevin Marsh then asked her, in a tone calibrated to sound like a genuine question while landing like a challenge, to walk through her interpretation of a specific volatility clustering model used in the Meridian restructuring. She walked through it, then she corrected an error in it. Not aggressively, just clearly, the way you'd point out someone had left their keys on the table. Kevin Marsh blinked. That's not an error, that's a modeling choice. It's a choice that underweights tail risk by approximately 11%, Elise said, which means the capital reserve buffer the model recommends is insufficient. which is fine if market conditions stay stable. It becomes a problem in a stress event. Silence. The restructuring in Q3 last year, she continued. Was that during a mild stress period? The currency volatility in August? Nobody answered. She already knew the answer. She'd found it in the footnotes. Kevin Marsh looked at Thomas Grail. Thomas Grail's expression had changed, not dramatically. But Elise was good at reading small changes, the slight tension around his jaw, the way he'd stopped tapping his pen. She said, calmly, "I'd like access to the Meridian records now, please." He gave it to her, not willingly. He made 3 phone calls first, one of which she could hear through the glass wall of the conference room. A rapid and hushed conversation that ended with him looking back at her like she was a problem he no longer knew how to categorize. She was in that conference room for 6 hours. When she came out, she went directly to Russell Vane's office. She knocked on the doorframe. Russell Vane looked up from whatever he was reading with the expression of a man who had forgotten she existed. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked. He gestured at the chair across from his desk the way you gesture at an empty chair in a waiting room. She sat down. She opened her notebook to a page covered in neat, precise writing. She placed it on his desk and turned it to face him. "The Meridian portfolio was restructured 4 times, she said. The stated reason, each time, was market optimization. The actual function, from what I can reconstruct, was risk displacement, moving exposure off the primary balance sheet and into a subsidiary structure that wasn't subject to the same reserve requirements. The error in the volatility model isn't incidental. It was likely used to justify reserve levels that wouldn't otherwise have passed internal review." Russell Vane looked at the notebook. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's a significant allegation," he said finally. "Yes," Elise said. "It is. Do you have documentation?" She placed a second document on his desk. The pages were flagged in 7 places, each flag corresponding to a specific discrepancy cross-referenced in her notes. Russell Vane looked at the documents. Then he looked at Elise. Something shifted in his face, some long-held assumption quietly rearranging itself. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. 11 years, she said. He was quiet for another moment. "Thomas will push back." "He can," she said. "The math won't." Thomas Grail did push back. He was waiting outside Russell Vane's office when Elise came out. He'd assembled something, a counter-argument, documentation of his own, a performance of controlled outrage worn like a suit. "The Rousseau Group will be hearing about this," he said. Not loudly. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make a threat feel like a threat. "You came in here with an agenda. You went after a specific portfolio without cause. That's not an audit, that's a fishing expedition." Elise stopped walking. She turned to face him. She was a full head shorter. She was still carrying her notebook. She was calm in a way that he found, she could tell, deeply aggravating. "Mr. Grail," she said, "I came in here with a mandate. The mandate was to review risk exposure and portfolio integrity. That's what I did." She paused. "If you'd like to dispute my findings, you're welcome to commission a second opinion. I can recommend 3 firms. All of them will find the same things I found, because the numbers don't change depending on who's looking at them." Thomas Grail stared at her. She turned and walked back toward the 11th floor. Behind her, she heard him say nothing. That, too, was an answer. The formal report took 2 weeks to complete. It was 47 pages. It was reviewed by the Rousseau Group's senior partners, 2 of whom called Elise personally. Not to congratulate her, exactly, but to ask how she'd found what she'd found and whether she was certain. She was certain. The report went to Hartwell's board. It then went through channels Elise was not directly involved in to the relevant financial oversight bodies. Thomas Grail resigned 3 weeks after the report was filed. The official statement said, "to pursue other opportunities." It was the kind of statement that explained nothing, and everyone understood perfectly. Kevin Marsh quietly corrected the volatility model. The Meridian portfolio was restructured again, this time for real, under close supervision, with reserves that actually matched the risk. Russell Vansey sent Elise an email. It was 3 sentences long. The last one said, "I underestimated the scope of what you were doing here. I won't make that mistake again." She read it on the 47 bus, on the way to her next file. The coffee was cold again. She didn't mind. Brenda Calloway, the compliance officer who had whispered to Thomas Grail on that first morning, sent a different kind of message, a longer one. She'd been at Hartwell for 9 years, she wrote. She'd raised concerns about the Meridian portfolio internally, twice, and been told the risk modeling was sound. She thanked Elise for finding what she'd found. She said she didn't know whether to feel relieved or furious. Elise wrote back one line. Both is the right answer. She never heard from Glenn the security guard. She didn't expect to. There's a thing that happens to people who don't look the part. A tax, some have called it, the invisible surcharge of having to prove yourself before you're even allowed to begin. Elise Fontaine had been paying that tax since she was 19 years old, sitting in a university office while an advisor suggested gently that she might want to consider a more practical program than mathematics. She'd smiled then the same way she smiled in boardrooms. The same stillness, the same quiet assessment of the room. Then she'd gone and done the work anyway. She always did the work anyway. The jacket is still in rotation. The suitcase with the broken wheel finally gave out somewhere around file 39. She replaced it with an identical model, different color. The coffee goes cold on transit more often than not. None of that has anything to do with what she knows. And what she knows, that's the part nobody in any lobby, any boardroom, any glass tower has ever been able to take from her. I want to ask you something before you go. How many times have you walked into a room and felt the temperature drop? Felt the eyes do that quick calculation, that snap judgment that decided who you were before you said a single word? Maybe it happened to you in a job interview, a classroom, a meeting where you knew more than everyone at the table but nobody asked. Maybe you've been on the other side of it too, and you caught yourself doing it to someone else, and it sat wrong with you afterward. That's the thing about Elise's story. It's not really about finance. It's about what we assume, and what we miss when we assume it. The numbers didn't care what she was wearing. The risk exposure didn't adjust itself based on who found it. Truth has an uncomfortable habit of being true, regardless of who delivers it. If this story stayed with you, tell me why in the comments. I read them, all of them. And if you've got a story of your own about a room that underestimated you, drop it below. Those are the ones I find myself thinking about longest. If you haven't subscribed to Hollow Stories yet, now's a good time. New story every week. Some of them are harder than this one. Some of them end differently. But they're all real in the ways that count. I'll see you in the next one.